So I guess on that note, Sally, very, very welcome to our next podcast series. We titled it the Enforcement Series, but actually, what it's turned out to be, by the pure nature of the guests we have, is a bit of a financial crime series. But that's pretty topical, and certainly we're very, very grateful to have you on. So, for our audience, Sally has spent a couple of decades in the fraud prevention, investigations, governance, and remediation space. So I think your work is super valuable in terms of the conversation we'll have today because it spans kind of all the different changes that have happened to businesses within the last 20 years or so, where we've had newer technologies, emerging technologies, and now obviously AI. And so systems and controls have changed, and especially in that investigation space. So yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. And if you wouldn't mind giving a bit of an intro.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Anastasia, and thank you for having me. Yeah, so you're being very generous. My career is far longer than a couple of decades. I started work in 1986, so I'm 40 years in now. But in the early 90s, I was at HSBC at the time. I did 25 years at HSBC, and joined the fraud team in the early 90s. So quite 35, 37 years ago, and
I did read that, but I was like, surely that's not right. You don't actually look old enough to have been there then.
I've got a massive filter. No, it is right. Yeah, I started work, and I HSBC was a fabulous place to work in that I never did the same job for more than 2 years, but I never actually applied for a new job. You just got moved in those days, so you sort of did it 18 months in one role, and then they'd say, okay, we're going to put you in a different role. So I got to learn a lot very early on about fraud, right from application right through to investigations and writing money off. And actually, in those early days of me being in the fraud teams, customers would write to us to say they've got fraud. They'd get a paper statement, they'd write to us, we'd write back and say we've asked the merchant for a voucher. We'd get the copy of the voucher, which we'd photocopy and send, and that's how it worked. So we relied heavily on customers telling us fraud was happening. And then in the 90s, we introduced the first fraud detection system, which was kind of looking at patterns of behavior, what normal looked like for customers on a whole customer demographic, right down to what does normal look like for this particular person. And then we started being much more proactive as a banking industry in saying, we think this is unusual activity for you or for our customers. And that was a massive turning point for the banks, I think. The reliance on stepping away from customers telling us, and we were telling the customers. And in those days, things like scams, if customers lost money to a scam, that was it. They lost their money. And obviously we have very different rules around that now. So I had 25 years there and saw a lot of change. It went from the old magstripe card swipes to chip and pin. We started using 3D Secure on internet banking, internet transactions. Then everybody was launching apps and internet banking platforms, etc. So there's an awful lot of change certainly in the last 30 years, and then in the last 5 or 10, way more in that kind of AI space. I left HSBC in 2012 and then mostly consulting since then. I worked for a couple of small banks as well. And but in the consulting world, I've worked for large global consulting firms, which not only gave me the opportunity to work across a large banking remit, so still with global banks, but also working with small asset management firms, insurance firms, within the FS space, but actually more broader than that in the manufacturing space, industrial manufacturing, healthcare, aerospace, pharmaceuticals. I've worked with lots of different companies, and fraud spans anyone who is in business is at risk of fraud. And it was a really lovely opportunity when I worked for the consulting firms to be able to articulate how fraud might happen in a kitchen manufacturer, for example. And then in January, I thought, you know what, I want to work slightly differently. I work as a freelance fraud consultant now, so I have the opportunity to pick and choose my clients, which is lovely, pick and choose my hours. I am coming to the end of my career, and what I'm trying to do now is work with
You've only
work
been
with.
in the space 20 years, Sally, according to me. You've got ages.
I know. If I no, I don't. I'm tired. I'm tired now. So I'm at the point now where I'm kind of just it's not just about me stopping. It's about me handing over to the next generation of fraud leaders and making sure that they're not equipped, because they already are, but just that they've got some of the backstories that has led us here. So that journey from the reliance on customers identifying fraud, through to us doing it, the banking industry doing it ourselves. And actually, is there a place now for customers to also, for the banks to say to the customers, just check your statements now and again. Don't rely entirely on us, because sometimes, for all the systems that we've got in place, all the detection tools that we have and the prevention systems that we have, sometimes some things will get through, and we will need you to take some responsibility to say, I'm still going to check my own statement. I'm not going to rely on the bank to do it for me. And there is a really good, healthy balance there of, just making sure that you know what you're expecting to come out of your bank account. And if something is unusual, it's okay to alert your bank.
And that's a really good point. I was actually out for coffee like a few weeks ago, and I was just chatting to someone in the coffee shop, and she was grabbing a coffee for her granddaughter, and she was using cash to pay. And it's very unusual that you even have the ability to pay in cash in London nowadays. But she said, "Oh, you know what? I much prefer paying in cash, because then I know exactly what I'm spending where, and it's driven by
Yeah.
me." She was like, "I actually don't think that the bank statements are clear enough as to what the transaction pertains to." And I thought, you know what, how interesting, where we're in a world of consumer duty, we still haven't got to a place where people can recognize the transactions really easily. And I was
Yeah.
actually going to write a LinkedIn post to say, can someone actually sort this out? Because no matter how old you are, that is something that's still kind of, typically you look at a transaction, if it's a few quid, you don't even bother asking where it's from. But you'll have experienced where they are perhaps test transactions from fraudsters
Yeah.
effectively. So if you
Yeah.
don't have clarity, or if you don't understand what's going on within your banking transactions, how are you meant to then alert the bank as to something that's unusual? So I think that dual responsibility is a really good point, because as much as
Yeah, I was just going to say, as an education as well with the customers. So I had a debit on my account last week on a Tuesday for Marks and Spencers, and I kind of was like, hang on a minute, I didn't go. But actually, it was on the Saturday. But because it was a bank holiday weekend, it had taken a couple of days to come. Now I know that. So I
Mhm.
was like, okay, it wasn't a Tuesday, but no, it wasn't. Oh, it's bank holiday. So I kind of backtracked until I was in my head. Oh, I was in Marks and Spencers getting some bread or whatever it was. And I know that. I've been in this industry for a long time, but to the average person, it's not only inconvenient for the customer, but it's operationally really heavy for banks to have these customers ring them and say, I've got a debit. They have to go through, it's a 10-minute call. But if they get hundreds of these every day, and actually all it is it takes a couple of days to appear on your statement. Now, maybe it might not be everyone doing that, but if a percentage of customers are doing that and it actually is okay, how can we be better at putting smarter information on the bank statements, especially within the app, because there is more opportunity there to put a bit more information if you click on it. I don't know, it's not that isn't particularly my space, but yeah, you're quite right. From a customer point of view, it's not ideal if you've got to ring the bank just to double check a £5 debit.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting point about how can we make the feedback process more natural. We have all these systems available to us, but I got that feedback from being in a coffee shop. I doubt that lady would have then called the bank and said, you know what I'd really love is like a better way for doing XYZ. So I think we should really be able to, especially in this era of AI, really understand what customers want from beyond just questionnaires and your stereotypical feedback mechanisms. You should be able to kind of, in my view, get that from a much more rounded and holistic way nowadays. But your point about training is an interesting one, because I think we're getting to a place or to a world where training needs to happen both internally and externally. So both to the client base or your customer base, very much so, exactly as you're saying, even the basic stuff, but also internally. You mentioned investigations and how you've kind of come up the curve with the curve,
Yeah.
from having to do things very manually, where you would actually effectively be processing data even very manually, interacting with the customer base very manually on a case by case basis. Whereas I feel like with kind of the way that we operate now, with systems taking more of a lead with processing the initial or core data or data sets about consumers, what do you think the next phase of training looks like for the people, for the newer generation of fraud or financial crime investigators in general, where they're not even interacting with that data set? How do they know what's unusual, or what does that training look like, do you
Yeah,
think?
it's a really interesting one, because one of the questions I was asked when I started my consulting journey is, what AI tools, what machine learning tools can we bring into investigations at the first triage? And whilst obviously you want, okay, if it's less than 20 quid, you probably don't want to investigate it, you just charge it back, write it off, whatever, those low level transactions. But actually, the human interaction at an early stage is where you learn your trade as a good investigator. And introducing nothing but AI into that entry level investigation role worries me that we will lose our experienced investigators who become assistant managers and managers, because that is lost, because everything is being done by AI. I think there needs to be a healthy balance. There is absolutely a place for some of the really humdrum roles and processes to be outsourced. Yes, of course, but that is still reliant on engineers writing good code, modelers understanding the data that they're working with, analysts looking at the output and making sure that those rules are tweaked, etc., etc. And then whatever falls out of that, that's where your entry level investigator sits, obviously. But investigations can be really complex or very, very simple. So fraud investigators in the banks are sometimes labelled as investigators, and they're processing chargebacks. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that kind of simple first stage fraud investigation. Is it fraud? Yes, it looks a bit dodgy to me. We're going to charge it back. There's nothing wrong with understanding that process, because it really helps you as you go through your career. But then you might have something slightly more complicated, like a first party fraud investigator, where you absolutely need to have a human interaction on that one, because this is where you don't believe the customer's story, where the customer is saying, that Tiffany necklace, I didn't buy it, right? And a machine is not going to be able to always provide a good human judgment on that, because first of all, humans will lie within the investigation process. And actually, if you only investigate first party fraud cases where you're suspicious, if you don't have a human interaction on the phone, my worry with that is, if you're lying about what happened on a chat, right, within an app, if the human at the bank is coming back to you saying, all right, Anastasia, tell us what happened in Tiffany's, and you go blah 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 blah, this is what happened, it can't possibly have been me, I was in this country, and then I go, okay, can you just tell the story again just to tweak it? You can go back in the chat and look at exactly what you've said. If I've had a conversation with you, you've got to remember exactly what you said, because by God, I'm taking notes about this as an
Mm-hmm.
investigator, and you've got to remember the lie you've told,
Yeah.
which is really hard if the investigator is well trained and going, oh, you said you got the bus at 10:15 and it was a number 2, but actually the second time you told me you got the bus at 12:15 and it was the number 7. Which of those, in it?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
a
yeah.
computer isn't, because like I say, on a chat, a fraudster will just go back and go, well, this is what I told them.
Yeah.
So there are elements of where you absolutely need human intervention, but that is, and also with scams, to make sure that there is some understanding of what the customer is saying, some empathy shown. It's really difficult to get that in an app, but there are some frauds, low level mass frauds, where it's the 2.99 delivery charge or whatever it is. You don't need a human to get in touch on those sorts of things. But it's the repeat offenders, it's the repeat cases, anything slightly unusual. that balance of getting machine learning to learn, obviously, and make some decisions, but actually being smart enough to go, we haven't got enough here, this needs humans to take a judgment on. And I'd like to think there will always be a place for humans in investigations, purely because sometimes it just smells a bit funny, and I can see that, but I'm not convinced an AI tool will be able to.
Yeah, and it's funny because I've been taught ever since I was a young compliance whippersnapper, I've always been taught if it smells funny, it probably is funny.
100%.
And how can you smell something funny if you're not interacting with it? And I think so much of financial crime is behavior led, and because machine learning, it understands language really, really well, but it doesn't understand behavior the way we understand behavior as humans and interacting with it. And the other thing I think is that's really critical is I'm not yet sure that we're at a place where we can necessarily understand vulnerability without having client or customer interactions in the same
Yeah.
way that we used to. I think there are systems or technology that's coming up the curve with vulnerability, or certainly pattern recognition for fraud or financial crime susceptibility. But again, even for the training component for the people that are doing the investigations, I think it's important for them to be able to understand what vulnerability looks like in practice. Because back to the point around what systems can and can't do, at the end of the day, as an investigator or as the person in charge of the system, you need to know what the escalation is telling you, or whether it's a true escalation, or how you then manage it, and what is best practice around a system giving you a certain output. What do you then do with it if you haven't ever had to interact with the underlying data or customers in person? And I think that's
Yeah,
the downside of systems.
yes, absolutely. And you look at the high street now, right? There's less and less branches around for customers
Yeah.
who are potentially the more vulnerable. They are, I mean, the banking hubs that are being set up around the country are a great innovation, right? They're mostly, a lot of them are in libraries and post offices, which feels a lot more community driven. The people in there, I don't know, I was in there the other day doing some stuff for my mum, and I felt really safe. Like if an elderly person was in there chatting, because there's less pressure potentially for sales targets and everything else, it felt, I wouldn't have had too much of a problem if I'd gone in there and seen some vulnerable people and had been able to have a conversation with them. And the people working in those banking hubs have got some good training, obviously, but they are not certainly the gentleman I spoke to was a post office worker rather than an individual bank worker. So it felt like he would give really good rounded advice rather than being sold on trying to upsell a product potentially. And I don't know what, the branch staff have targets on different products at all, but I sort of like the banking hub vibe of come in, talk to us if you're worried about things. There was a separate room if there were concerns about vulnerability. I really liked that, because I think that some vulnerable customers have not got that ability now to go into a bank because their branches are shutting. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think the banking hubs are a good innovation. And there will always be a level of people who choose not to bank digitally, can't bank digitally, are hard of hearing, so want to speak to somebody face to face, are potentially blind, so they can't use a phone, that kind of thing, but they'll be able to use different things. So we have to make sure that all of our vulnerable customers, whether it's a hidden or an unhidden disability, or whether they are going through a period in their life where they are potentially more vulnerable than another time, that they are looked after. And everybody is obliged to do that. And you're quite right, that balance of the data and the systems being smart enough to spot that, and risk management generally is all about, does something feel right? That doesn't matter if it's fraud, credit, disaster recovery, whatever sort of risk management we're talking about. It's about common sense. Does it feel right? Does it feel like pretty normal? If the answer is no, there's something wrong with it. And it's very difficult for a machine to always get that right. And because humans don't always get that right.
Exactly. So we don't even know how to build machines that get it right because neither do we.
Oh,
And I
100%.
think, yeah, so if we're starting with us who don't get it right all the time and don't
Yeah,
understand human behavior, we can try our best, but we don't actually have the full picture. How can we possibly then impart that into a system? And especially then you get into all sorts of biases that are now worked into the system as a result of years and years of learning based on information that's biased too, which that's another conversation altogether. But you mentioned there, how we went through a period of commercial drivers to open more branches, and now we're closing those branches, or I guess creating other spaces for banking
yeah.
interactions. And it's really interesting because that's just one cycle of systems and controls changes effectively. So you will have experienced how systems and controls have really evolved in the fraud space over the last 20, 30 years. Where are banks or asset management companies approaching the AI era with a good perspective? Are you seeing some good work around actually rebuilding the core infrastructure, or do you think that there's still a lot of layering going on top of historic infrastructure, trying to build stuff over the top rather than really
Yeah.
reanalyzing how businesses are changing fundamentally?
I think it depends on the size of the organisation, right? You've got some really great new banks. You've got your Monzos, the Starlings, lots of other great new banks who are building from the ground up and are able to. They're coming at it with a blank sheet of paper, right? Now they don't, and like all the banks, no one gets it right all the time. And then you've got the legacy banks who are huge, massive infrastructures, many of whom have bought other banks in,
Yeah.
and they've got these layers upon layers and layers. And they get it right a lot of the time, and they get it wrong a lot of the time. All of them do. And they all see similar frauds, and they all react in different ways and at different paces. I think my advice to all the banks, regardless of how big they are, is of course you want to introduce as much automation and smooth customer journeys for your customers as possible. But it will depend on your demographic, right? So the newer banks accept that their customers are predominantly under 35, they're really happy on an app. Great. The older banks, especially the old building societies, potentially some of the older, more well-established banks, will have a demographic of new customers because mum and dad have set their kids up with accounts and now they're maturing potentially. But also they've got some older generation who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, who some of them will be absolutely brilliant, really tech savvy, but some of them won't be. And then obviously, like I said, there will be people who choose not to bank digitally for whatever reason. So my advice is always to all the banks to offer a suite of ways in which customers can contact you and they get the best service, the same service, whatever way they choose to. Some customers who bank digitally only accept that they probably will never get to speak to a human and they don't need to. But it might be that actually that account for them is their spend account. It's not their direct debits, it's not their bill payments, it's their buying a coffee, going to McDonald's, whatever. But their main bank account potentially is one of the big banks because actually I've got more options in communicating with those banks if I can. Someone like First Direct have a really great business model of, yes, you can always speak to us, right? There's always a human if you want to speak to us. And that still works really well for them. And it's been in place for, I remember the launch of First Direct when it was telephone banking and it was really innovative. And they've really moved with the times. But the ethos at First Direct is always about the customer. And actually, when you go to their offices, it's really vibrant, it's really buzzy. It's always been a really good place. And I always say if I lived in Leeds, that's where I'd want to work. And then you've got other banks who are doing fantastic stuff in the AI space, in the non-human to human. They're doing a machine learning to human. But for the most part, there is almost always an option to drop out of that chat and say, actually, can I speak to somebody? And if banks and management companies, asset management companies, whoever, if they don't have that option, what you'll find is your customers will say to you, I'm finding it really difficult to speak to you when I need a bit of reassurance. It might be for any reason whatsoever. It could be fraud. It could be I've lost my job, someone's died, there's been a flood in my house, I need to speak to somebody about an insurance quote, whatever that crisis is for them. For the most part, 3/4 of people, when we've done a bit of research in certain places, 3/4 of people will say, when I need reassurance, I actually want to speak to a human or see a human, not through a chatbot.
Mm-hmm.
Now that is all demographics. That's 18 to 80-year-olds, right? And actually within that under 35, it's still a generation that it's still about 3/4 of people saying, yeah, I just want to speak to a human. And I think it comes back down to that human psychology of, I need a teacher, I need a policeman, I need my parent, that we are told as children. So I think the balance is all about offering customers as many ways to contact you as possible. Some customers will still need to write to you. For whatever reason, they will choose to write to you. So everything from written communication right through to AI. Now that is much harder for the legacy banks because they've got really long contracts with solution providers. They've got massive systems that need huge overhauls before they can introduce anything small, let alone a whole new way of working. And that's coupled with organizational restructures, outsourcing to different countries, onshoring processes that they outshored 5 years ago and haven't worked and have to come back. So the banks are huge global organizations, the legacy banks. And then, as I say, the smaller challenger banks, the tier twos, the neo banks, the digital banks, they get a lot right in that tech space too. But they need to also balance it with remembering that their customers do still need a human on the phone sometimes.
Yeah, and I guess on the challenger banks or digital banks in that space, I think one of the things you and I have discussed in the past is the fact that though they're fantastic on some of the data and the system side of things, and maybe you can give us an insight as to what data ownership looks like within those banks. I know you've worked for digital or challenger banks in the past, because I think that's kind of a core component of getting systems right, is having people that really at least understand the data. Then if you're having fewer interactions with a customer, the data you get or the data that's built into the systems has got to be cleaner, better, more usable, more complete. So the data ownership and the governance around data, I think that's got to be quite strong, I'd imagine, within those type of organizations. So maybe you can give us an insight as to what that looks like.
Of course, and I've worked with lots of different firms as a consultant, and the one thing I've struggled with is when you have a huge suite of data products within some of the banks, some of the insurance companies, some of lots of different places. The way in which the data is filtered and cut can give you different results. So, if there is a big, huge suite of products and you filter it and just say, right, I want this, this, and this. If you've got one filter different between the product teams and the risk teams, for example, if you filter the data slightly differently, you're going to have different results. So you have to be really sure that everybody's using exactly the same data and exactly the same filters within that data to make sure that you're coming out with the same results. Otherwise, you're just cutting data to tell you what you want it to hear. Sometimes it felt like with some firms, and I won't, it's not as a consultant, that we're told we need to tell the board that our fraud isn't a problem, or we need to tell the board that fraud has increased or decreased or whatever. Can you help us tell that story? Rather than having a look at the data and letting the data tell the story for you. Sometimes it's a gut feel. Sometimes, like, I'd work with internal audit teams and they'd be like, we think there's a problem somewhere because we've looked at some data, but we don't know how to track it back to, and that's fine. And as long as you're open to actually, you've misinterpreted the data, you haven't included some fraud in that data. The classic example would be first party fraud, where some banks would be credit losses. Some credit losses include first party fraud. Some credit losses don't include first party fraud. So you're kind of like, which is it? So are you included first party in credit or fraud? actually within the same organization, different parts of the organization would report it in different ways. And you kind of think this is really unhelpful as far as your reporting to the regulator goes. It's really unhelpful as far as the UK fraud figures go, because everyone's cutting their data slightly differently. But actually, the first thing to get right is your own in-house. So your product teams, your risk teams, your systems and controls teams, everybody's looking at the same suite of data, filtering it exactly the same way and looking at exactly the same trends. Because if you track it back, and I don't know, your first filter at the top is kind of, I don't know, first versus third party or external versus internal, and you've got one kind of tiny filter slightly differently, everything else is going to run down and just be different. So my advice is always make sure you're all using the same suite of data. You don't have 10 different dashboards for what you think is the same thing. Because I have worked with firms that have gone, oh yeah, we use this because we've designed it, and someone else is saying, oh, we've got the same data, but actually we've applied our own filters and this is where we think we are. So it's really, really important. And it sounds really basic and simple, but actually I've worked with large, well-known firms who are within the firm thinking that their fraud figures are different.
You know, you say it sounds basic, but I actually think in where we're going or where we're headed towards a more kind of integrated systems-based framework or infrastructure for all businesses of all types and all sizes and all categories. The most interesting thing is I haven't seen and in all fairness, my career hasn't spanned that long, but even in my 12 plus years, you can see where this is really a pivotal point to reevaluate your systems and controls like never before, because I think we've layered over the last probably 30 years or so, we've gone from kind of very manual processes to then starting to gather data for our Excel spreadsheets and formulas. Those are then driving the systems, that the deterministic systems that we currently use more often than not. And then that same framework is expected to power probabilistic systems with probabilistic outcomes without even looking at that underlying data to say, actually, is this right? And have we tracked it over the last 20, 30 years to make sure we're gathering data sets that reflect exactly where the organization is. So I think never have we been in a better time, but also a more commercially pressured time, it feels like, to do that core analysis, the basic stuff, and see if the basic stuff can actually stand up against scrutiny, and if it's complete and if it's accurate.
And it's hard for the banks, because obviously they have to run the bank. And you know, we when you're in the banks, it's kind of build a bank and run a bank, right? And if you were building from scratch, of course you could do lots of the things that we would love to do now with all the hindsight that we have, but they've still got to run a bank, so they can't switch off what they've got. And you know, in my head, I'm like, oh, if I was starting again, we would do it really differently now. But it's really difficult. So this is why some of the challenger banks are great, because they are literally starting with a blank sheet of paper and trying to learn from what everyone else is doing and try to be different. But actually, some of the things that the big banks do are really good, really robust, and really fit for purpose. And some of what the digital banks are doing is really good, really innovative, and everyone can learn from each other.
I think you have to be like
Yeah,
that.
it's not
I think
competitive.
it can't be competitive purely from even from the process of client outcomes. If you're seeing a pattern somewhere, if anything, I think we need more collaboration around risk and compliance now, in all of those areas, including financial crime prevention. In fact, I think it's probably the key pillar of why we need to be more collaborative, but also just in general around outcomes received from AI based systems, because I think there's a lot of learning to get up the curve right now, and not everybody understands technology and is an SME. And
No,
in
absolutely.
order to get up that curve, you need to understand or start understanding both. And the only way to do that is to communicate with your
Yeah,
other colleagues
100%.
and other participants in the space. Like,
Yeah,
what
and
what does bad outcomes?
I would also add on that we mustn't forget that the criminals share everything,
Yeah.
right? So they're out there on the dark web. They're conversing about who's controls are broken, who's got data for sale, blah, 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 blah. So they're communicating. So we need to remember that actually that sharing of collective trends, etc., is really important to protect each other.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point as well about the fact that if criminals are sharing whose controls are broken, then you're more vulnerable, but also you can share that vulnerability with
Yeah.
others to say, by the way, and I don't know whether there should be some sort of anonymous forum for, compliance professionals, but simultaneously they can get infiltrated too. And I
Yeah.
think, coming back to the criminal space, I don't know whether this is an unpopular opinion or a popular opinion, but do you think actually the fact that fraud and financial crime risk is at an all-time high now with different type of technological fraud that's evolving, um, do you think it's actually helping firms innovate faster because the risks are growing?
I do, and I think the focus is good from the media. Social media has been a massive accelerator when it comes to scams and fraud, especially in the scam space. We're always bombarded, unless it's just my feed is bombarded, but we see it all
Yeah,
the time.
me
There's
too.
there's TV shows, scam interceptors. Some of it does make me wonder whether we customers are better at reporting fraud now. It's easier to report it. They understand what fraud looks like now. And I'm not saying that it hasn't always been like this. I'm just wondering whether we're getting better at spotting it. We're getting better at stopping it. Customers are getting better at stopping and spotting it as well. But I do think the eyes on the industry is helpful. I think the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act has alerted other businesses to the potential of fraud as well, because as I said in my introduction, fraud will happen everywhere. Now, obviously, the proceeds of the fraud are trafficked through the banks. The money is filtered through the banks, but the fraud very often will happen at another firm. Like I said, a kitchen manufacturer, a pharmaceutical company, or customers, etc. So I think that has meant other firms are sitting up and taking notice, which has meant the expectation of their bank. So if let's say you're running a huge retail store, you arguably your expectation of your bank is actually you should be spotting fraud through my tills, as well as me having some controls within my teams as well. And I think when you look at, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, somewhere like a Sainsbury's retail may or may not have had a head of fraud, whereas now Sainsbury's retail 100% will have a head of fraud. The Sainsbury's bank always did as well, but the retailers have now got fraud teams, much more in the compliance space, much more in the risk space as well, in that prevention and detection and investigation of. And I think it's much more commonplace now to have fraud teams in non-banking industry, than it is just in the banks. I would guess that 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, those probably didn't exist as much. It probably sat within legal or maybe a compliance team, whereas now it's very, very much, the retailers have fraud teams.
Yeah. And I guess it's a good point about, the evolving nature of the regulatory and legislative landscape,
Yeah.
which gets us to be, I guess, more financial crime and fraud aware.
Yes.
But in terms of the risks themselves, say you have an organization that has or is in scope of the failure to prevent fraud offence, or the directors are, where would you get them to start on their fraud risk frameworks? Because I guess it all starts by, even assessing your core risks, like where are your core risks? And how funny that a lot of people, well, not necessarily get it wrong, but don't know where to start.
Yeah, I've been asked a lot with of firms, who are falling under the failure to prevent fraud offence. Where do we start? What do we do? In my view, it's pretty simple. I will talk at the top, right? I want to go to the CEO, to the chief exec, to the C-suite. That tone from the top is really important, and you kind of go, okay, what do you have right now, and where do you think fraud happens in your business? Because I will have a view. Even before I've even gone into a business, I will have a view based on what they do as to how fraud happens. And the way to think about it for me, this is my view, is how does money leave your business? because any way money leaves your business is where fraud could, would, may, is, or is almost certainly happening, right? So that's staff, customers, suppliers. They're the three ways generally money will leave your business. Now that will be posing as staff, customers, so it's invoices, it's customer refunds, this is in the non-banking space, it's any payroll issues. So that's where you start. But the 6 pillars that the guidelines for the failure to prevent fraud offence have are really, they're pretty straightforward. They fall in line with the failure to prevent bribery and the tax evasion offences, which businesses should also have in place. So there should be some sort of footprint there at least for them to be able to mirror. And it's really simple. It's about, what are our risks? The best thing most firms can do, and this isn't me trying to sell consulting, is get somebody outside in, because it's really easy when you're in a business to not see the risks. And actually, what is really useful is to have an SME in there to say, whether it's a firm or whatever, even your internal audit teams potentially, to give that independent oversight of where we think that might be a problem. But your legal teams need to be involved as well, obviously. And then understanding all the processes that are involved in money leaving your business, whether that's accounts payable, whether that's HR and payroll, whether that's your contact with your customers, everything involved in that is where you need to start mapping out your risk assessment. And then from your risk assessment, you kind of identified your risks, you've identified the likelihood and the outcome, etc. And then you can start building your response plan, your training and monitoring. And then if you go top down with that approach, before you know it, you've also got the bottom up. And the bottom up is your training and awareness. How does that feed upwards? So it is a top down, bottom up approach. But my view, I was working with a charity years ago, and they said, if we had charity fraud, who's the first person you would speak to? And I'm like, Chief Finance Officer in the charity, because of the nature of how they work. That's the person I'd be talking to. He was quite offended when I told him that, and I said, I'm sure you're not, but
yeah. But that's the risk. Yeah, that's where the risk sits. Yeah.
That's where a big risk happens in charities. So yeah, is for understanding your business is really important, but top down first, because top down, getting that right, getting the culture right, having good whistleblowing lines, having good mechanisms for reporting fraud as a customer, as a supplier, as a member of staff, and that then automatically becomes a bottom up feeder as well. So you've got like a hamburger of fraud risk management.
And it's good you mentioned there, just start with, how does money leave your company? And that's such a good, straightforward, everyone can understand sort of takeaway to kind of give back to firms that are starting on that journey. Well, hopefully they had started and implemented it by last year, but for someone coming in today or that's listening today, I guess an interesting point that you mentioned there, get someone external to come in and actually give you advice or kind of look at it from an independent view. I guess the risk to that, where I often found maybe internally people were very quick to say, oh, well, we'll get a template from somewhere, or we'll get someone external to come in and tell us. And it's like, actually, fraud, I keep referring to things as financial crime in general, because I think sometimes it does apply to other pillars within financial crime. But in general, do you feel like there is a good understanding of risks within businesses, especially by different divisions, where it might impact them in different ways? And how do you think the training portion of risks associated with financial crime, as they're changing, increasing, evolving, how do you think that, heads of compliance, if there isn't a head of fraud or obviously financial crime MLRO, but yeah, how should firms be approaching educating on the risks from the inside, and not just relying on external sources to come in and point and say, actually, that's where your risk sits? Because it should be intuitive a little bit
totally.
as well.
there's a massive balance, right? So the external consultants can really help because they can bring in trends that are happening elsewhere that the internal guys won't see.
Agreed.
But
Yeah.
absolutely, I work with a number of companies to design training courses for them. But the questions I will ask them is, what sort of fraud do you think you're dealing with? What sort of fraud have you had? What haven't you considered? But things like mandatory training programs within certain firms, whether they're regulated or not, you know, most times when you join a firm, you have to do a number of training courses.
Yeah.
How to pick up a box, health and safety, really important, right? Is your desk space at home set up correctly? Really important. I have yet to come across a training program, a mandatory training program that really does specifically call out fraud. You have bribery and corruption, you might have money laundering, you might have independence, ethics, all of the really important fundamentals of business, right? But actually, fraud happens a lot. And apart from a little bit on the whistleblowing and maybe in the bribery and corruption, it's almost a subset of financial crime. It is a subset of financial crime. But the reality is, fraud happens more often than any other crime in the UK, certainly as far as our reported figures go, right?
Yeah.
So why on earth don't firms have a specific fraud training program, or even just a mandatory program, a 45-minute demonstration of these are the frauds that we know we've had as a business. These are some frauds that happen in the UK. This is what fraud is. This is the penalties. These are the consequences. This is how we think fraud might occur. And it's a collaborative approach, i.e., the external guy going, right, don't forget these could happen. The internal guys going, this has happened. And I've worked with some firms who are really good at publicly, or certainly internally, maybe not publicly, but internally saying to their staff, we had some fraud this month. We had some fraud last year. This is what it looked like. Staff were sacked. Customers were exited, whatever. And I've worked with other firms who do not report it internally at all because they're embarrassed. They don't think it's important. They don't want their staff to be aware that fraud happens. And it does. And there's nothing wrong with that, because actually what talking about it does is say, this is the consequences. These are the controls we've put in place to stop it happening again. And actually, if anyone spots a hole in the control, please tell us, because we don't want to fall foul of something else we might have missed. It's really important.
And I think one point that maybe we'll leave on today is, I think that there's a tone from certainly the FCA that I've felt over the last year or so that has really shifted from being less of a, I guess, aggressive concept that firms will get fined and there'll be harsh penalties. They're actually really open to hearing about what's happening within businesses and within control frameworks, especially around the systems and controls frameworks, how firms are approaching financial crime or other systems and controls in a different way, or maybe where things are going wrong. And I feel like there's a real collaborative approach with the industry that's starting to emerge, because the regulator, I feel like, really wants to get that data to understand what's going on. And that principles-based approach from the FCA, I feel like, is really coming out more so recently. Certainly that's how I felt.
Definitely. I think I don't know whether it's a change in the top at the FCA. I don't know whether the management has changed or what. And there was nothing, that is not a criticism of what went before. But you're right. It feels like it's almost like it's okay to make some small mistakes, as long as we can see some fixing, as long as we can see some talking about what went wrong, as long as that education piece is going on. I worked with a property management development company many years ago, and one of their competitors in the market had suffered a huge CEO compromise fraud, over £1 million. And that CEO went out to all the property management companies and said, this is what happened to me. We need to learn from this. And all the other big management companies in my remit were like, right, how can we stop this? And it really works. They put some controls in place. They had some really sensible solutions put in place to prevent that type of fraud. But what they hadn't done was thought about all the other types of fraud that might happen. And within the banks, I think the banks are very good at going, okay, we've solved this. We're not just going to walk away from it. What are we not thinking about? And they will always miss something. The criminals will always be one step ahead of us. That's the nature of the industry we work in. And you have to accept that as a risk professional. You have to accept that for the most part, we are reacting to a fraud or a fraud typology that's emerging. We're not criminals. We are reacting to their behaviour. But that's okay. We just need to be quick, smart, and shut the door as quickly as we can, so that they have to think of another innovative way to steal people's money.
And I guess on that note, maybe just one main takeaway from today from you.
Oh God, as I come to the end of my career, just if anyone's watching this and is at the start of their career or midway through, it's a great place to work. Fraud is great. It's always innovating, but please don't think you're ever going to solve the fraud problem. You aren't going to. And if you go into this world thinking I'm going to stop fraud, you're going to be very disappointed with yourself in your career. But if you go into it thinking I can stop some fraud, I can prevent some, then you'll of course you'll stop some fraud. You'll miss some as well, but that's okay.
And that's the nature of risk management, as you say.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sally, for coming on our podcast, and we've loved having you, and we've loved the conversation today. Super practical as well. Hopefully, some snippets that people will be able to kind of take away and implement. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Okay.